Hey, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the Nepalese-made Gahendra Martini, or the Gahendra rifle, which was one of the more notable rifles to come out of the Nepalese cache because of its relative rarity and obscurity before the cache was discovered. Now, before I go into the specifics of this rifle itself, you may be asking yourself, what is the Nepalese cache? So, in the early 2000s, a company called International Military Antiques, or IMA for short, purchased the whole of the contents of the old Royal Nepalese Armory in the Lagan Salakana Palace in Kathmandu. This was one of the largest undiscovered caches of antique military weapons dating back to the 1700s, which stored thousands of collectible rifles and muskets. Going back to the mid-18th century, with the foundation of the Nepalese kingdom, Nepal had a pretty rocky relationship with India and the British East India Trading Company. Borders were not well defined, and without going too deep into the geopolitical complexities of those relationships, both Nepal and the company were both expanding rapidly into each other's territories. Tensions grew, and in 1814, the Anglo-Nepalese War erupted and resulted in the company being able to recruit from Nepalese ranks, known as the Gurkhas. Nepal ultimately maintained their independence, but continued to be equipped with largely outdated armaments. Now, in the 1830s and 40s, the British administration in India thought a Chinese invasion from Tibet was a pretty realistic threat and considered supplying the Nepalese with up-to-date weapons, but were pretty suspicious that Nepal might help support anti-British interests in India. Well, in 1857, the Nepalese Gurkhas supported the British during the Indian Mutiny, which helped them secure more favor with the British, and the Gurkhas were allowed to bring back any weapons they were able to scavenge to Nepal. Still suspicious of giving Nepal the most up-to-date arsenal, the British decided they would supply the Nepalese with large quantities of arms, but only if they were a step down from what the British military were currently using. Now, the Nepalese, as a workaround, got very good at reverse engineering firearms. This meant smuggling a lot of the newest weapons, parts, tools, and machines into the country. They had a 400-mile border with India, so it was pretty difficult to effectively police this entire stretch of land for contraband or purchase weapons being brought back into Nepal. Schneiders, Martini Henrys, modern sporting rifles, Gatling guns, breech loaders of all kinds, etc., were brought back in and effectively copied, sometimes with really good accuracy and sometimes not so much. But it really does leave an interesting legacy and a number of handmade weapons that are quite unique. So this practice continued pretty much until the British eased weapons and ammunition restrictions to Nepal right before the First World War, and Nepal no longer needed to heavily rely on these copies. These weapons then accumulated over 100 years from all eras of firearms history, from Brown Besses, flintlocks in the 1700s, to percussion rifles, Enfields, Martinis, Schneiders, and stuff going all the way to World War II. This allowed people to be able to purchase weapons out of a time capsule that hadn't been available on the market in large numbers in US, Canada, Western Europe for decades. And I figured it'd be kind of cool to have a little bit of that history for myself, including an original British Martini Henry from Nepal, from the cache itself, as well as this Gahendra rifle. Now, this rifle was designed and named after General Gahendra Shamsher Jung Buduhur Rana. The Ranas were the ruling family at this time in Nepal, and he was a notable member of that family, specifically in terms of firearms development and modernization. Some consider him to be Nepal's first real scientist. The first thing you might notice is that this gun has the outward appearance of a British Martini Henry rifle. Internally, it's more related to an 1869 Wesley Richards design because it utilizes a falling hammer rather than a spring-loaded striker in the firing mechanism. Now, for caliber, it is also chambered for a 5.77 450 Martini Henry, which is also why some call it a Martini rifle. The best thing is just call it a Gahendra rifle because it is its own unique mashup. Now, no Nepalese sources can confirm where Gahendra found this inspiration for the Gahendra design, but it's likely from a single Wesley Richards rifle that was in the country at the time, found in the Nepal cache. Looking at the Gahendra rifle on the top and this Mark II Martini Henry on the bottom, the cosmetic differences suddenly become quite apparent. For example, the Gahendra lacks any external cocking indicator, which is present on all Martini Henry rifles. This would indicate if the rifle is cocked and ready to fire. The other major component is that unlike British and European manufactured weapons of the time, these were all handmade and assembled. All the parts had to be uniquely fitted to each gun, so they were not interchangeable with other Gahendra rifles. Also, the metal was of poorer quality, so shooting British imported 5.77 resulted in weapons failure on several notable occasions. Now, the fact that these handmade rifles are still operable today is quite amazing and attests to the high quality of craftsmanship and lengths the Nepalese went to make these. While modern shooters do fire these with lower loads, the bore diameter is not always consistent, and you should have this checked out by a gunsmith if you plan on shooting it. Now, looking at the rifle details, just like most rifles at the time, it has 2 barrel bands here and mid-stock, a cleaning rod, and 2 swivel swings, with the rear swivel swing being very wide to accommodate for the lever. Looking at the rear of the breech, the first inscription here reads, Army General Gahendra Shumsher Jean Buduhur Rana, and underneath it, it bears the sequential order 330, which is likely a serial number for this rifle. Some of the other Gahendra rifles will show the name of the current Prime Minister of this period, Chandra Shamshir Jean Buduhur Rana, as well as a battalion number or unit signifier, but this particular example does not have that. The actual breech body walls contain no inscriptions or markings, unlike the Martini Henry. The underbelly lever inscription reads Ge rifle, meaning Gahendra rifle in Nepali. The lever also has this unique teardrop design to it. On the left side of the rear sight, which is very much like a Martini Henry sight, you have 100, 200, 300, and 400, with 100 and 400 here and here being written in Nagari. And it's reported that these are actually in yards, denoted in yards. Now, as for operating and loading the rifle, it works just like any other falling block action. You engage the loading lever, which would drop the sliding block that contains the firing pin. You'll push the cartridge into the receiver and shut the block, which will in turn cock the rifle. The spent casing will then eject when you re-engage the loading lever. This pull on the trigger is quite intense, but unfortunately this rifle has a broken firing pin, so it really just exists as a historical example. By 1906, it was reported that just under 9,000 of these rifles had been manufactured at the Naku arsenal. Seeing as these were made in blocks of 999 in 7 different series, and how long it took to make each rifle, I'm guessing these were made between the late 1890s and the early 1900s, but I can't be certain for sure. Now, these rifles, when they were brought back from Nepal, were in an untouched condition and state, and that's basically the way they were sold, the same way that they were found in the palace in Nepal. The reason for many of these being in decent condition was because they were caked in yak grease, which acted as an early form of cosmoline, so we are pretty lucky to have them in the state that they are in, especially with bores and metal still largely intact. Now, much of the information on the Gahendra that I've used in this video is taken from a book called The Guns of the Gurkhas by John Walter, and it pretty much overviews a lot of the originals and copies of rifles that came out of the Nepal cache. So if you're interested in collecting these rifles, many are still available for purchase today, and I would certainly recommend that you pick up some books, because this really is a main source when it comes to cache weapons, and a lot of the information that you find out there comes directly from the main source. I also want to add that when the cache was purchased by IMA, about 5% of the palace inventory, or 2,500 long rifles, were left in Nepal for heritage purposes, but were never removed from the old palace. And unfortunately, during the April 2015 earthquake, the palace was destroyed, and pretty much all of the inventory inside was destroyed, which was a loss of history. But fortunately, we have a lot of these available today that we can maintain and keep alive. Hey guys, thanks again for watching. If you like this kind of content, feel free to subscribe. This is more for me to learn about the firearms that I own, especially the more antique ones and obscure ones that I'm not too familiar with, but it kind of drives me to do research. But there's always room for improvement, so I hope you continue watching. But anyway, I appreciate the views.